Hey, welcome everybody to the Learning and Development Metamorphosis presented by Sentinel Benefits and SHRM. I'm Nick Previn, a marketing specialist here at Sentinel. This webinar will be recorded, so everybody that is in attendance will receive the recording and the presentation, as well as free SHRM credits to update your credit board. Without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague and good friend, Lisa Vasallo, a people and culture generalist from Sentinel.
Thank you, Nick, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Nick mentioned, my name is Lisa Vasallo. I work on Sentinel's People and Culture team. I, for one, am really looking forward to gaining some valuable insights on today's topic. And with that in mind, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Erica Young. Erica serves as Enterprise Solutions Architect at SHRM, where she connects Fortune 500 organizations with solutions that positively impact people and business. This is evidenced by her 10+ year career in learning and development, organizational psychology, and HR. Since joining SHRM, Eric has held 3 roles, started off building research-based products on SHRM's research team, then moved on to founding the SHRM Labs team. SHRM Labs explores the intersection of work and technology, and currently Erica holds her position as Enterprise Solutions Architect on the SHRM Enterprise Solutions team. Erica has a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology with a focus in instructional systems design. She also holds her SHRM Senior Certified Practitioner SCP designation, is a co-host on the podcast Career Compass, and consistently speaks as an official SHRM Speakers Bureau speaker on workplace tech, the future of work, belonging, and upskilling. So Erica, quite the background. I'm really looking forward to your presentation today, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited, and thank you to Sentinel Benefits for hosting me today. This topic is near and dear to my heart. It's one that I often engage in conversation around, whether informally or formally. So I'm excited to do it formally with all of you today. I want to jump in with a story. And I'll do all the formal parts of the presentation in a bit, but I am really inspired by this story on a daily basis, and I think it's a fun way to start a conversation about the power of learning and development. And this story is about a man named George. George, I met George when I started my career several years ago, close to 10 years ago now. George was my student. He had been living in Washington, D.C. his whole life. He had come from really a community of poverty, and George was 82 years old when I met him. I met him because he was in my class, because he had decided one day that he wanted to learn how to use a computer. And when you think about the computer, especially those of us who were more on the digital native side, you think like, oh, I've had a computer my whole life. Like, why would somebody need to learn? But the truth is, for him and his generation, computers were not something that very quickly made its way into people's homes, and especially not into people's homes who didn't have the means to bring a computer in, because of course we know with any launch of a new technology, it's the most expensive then, and it's certainly a new expense to many people's lives. And so George had never used a computer, and now at the age of 82, he decided he wanted to change. And I think this is really the crux of what I think learning and development is about. It's about being inspired to make a change in our lives, having inspiration guide us through that change, having tools be there to support a change, and then also cultivating some kind of community support in order to keep us going toward that change. And what I love about this story is that George, again, at the age of 82, decided that he wanted to make this change. He wanted to get the tools needed. He was among other classmates who were older and who hadn't used a computer, who had a lot of anxiety about being in a classroom environment again, but had all of the pieces to be able to make that change. And the best part of this story for me personally is we were at one of the last classes together. And he said to me, I wish I had this when I was in high school. I might never have dropped out if I had. And I think what he was really pointing to was he was inspired, he was receiving tools, and he had support in his learning journey. And so I like this story to just kind of start off with kind of getting us back to the root of what learning and development is designed to do. It's designed to inspire change, and it's designed to give people the tools they need to make that change, whether professionally or personally. And so with that, I'll introduce myself. There was already, Lisa, thank you so much for the introduction in the beginning. So I won't repeat anything that was already said, but essentially I have a strong passion for people, plants, and psychology. I mentioned plants because in my personal life, I have a budding indoor jungle, as well as now an outdoor jungle. And in addition to that, really love this space of people, of psychology, and of how we can inspire change in little and big ways within our workplaces so that people can be the best selves and their most authentic selves at work. So for today, kind of switching gears here away from this, story to kind of what we're looking at with our time together today is I've sectioned this out into 4 categories. I want to start off and recap how learning and development has changed really just in the past 10 years. Then we'll look at some research and data supporting what L&D is looking like today and how that's likely going to bring us into the future of learning and development and the trends we're starting to predict. And then finally, all of that will kind of recap with, here's some tangible next steps that you can do as a L&D leader or an L&D influencer within your organization. But first, let's do a quick recap of where we've gone to where we are today. Learning and development just 10, even 5, even 3 years ago really looked like this. There was an instructor, there was a classroom of learners, and generally speaking, there was, the instructor did most of the talking, the learners participated in the activities or events and so on. But we're starting to see learning and the way we define learning really broaden over time. And so that's still, certainly a model that is used today. There are other models that we've explored over time, right? One of those models would be mentoring. And traditionally, and mentoring has seen quite a shift in the way we think about its power too. We used to think of mentoring as usually a leader who has had more experience, mentoring a leader who's had less experience, and that less experienced leader really getting the benefit of that mentorship relationship. But what we're seeing in this space is a more bi-directional approach, where now we're seeing mentoring really be seen, we're seeing mentoring as something that can impact positively both people, and both people can be mentored at the same time, regardless of rank or position or number of years of experience or so on and so forth. We're really embracing the idea that we have something, that everyone has something to give, and everyone has something to gain, and you can in that kind of a model. The other area where we're seeing change in the learning and development space is this idea of learning pathways. And this idea is really bred out of the fact that we each individually came to our place at this moment in time in an individual way, and we are going to continue on our path in an individual way. And so learning really has to morph to our very unique, specific desires, how we wish to grow, and the areas in which we need to grow. And so learning pathways, of course, are, basically individualized way to meet people's learning growth. And then finally, we can't leave out the influence of technology. Technology looking like, courses that you could go and sign up for right now online, all the way to individualized learning pathways that are app-based and gamified so that you are engaged the whole way. You could also argue something like TikTok, as silly as it might sound, also is a kind of individualized learning pathway. TikTok feeds you more information that you're interested in seeing. And now we see a lot of people on TikTok who who are SMEs, right, in their own right, in whatever it is that they do, sharing knowledge about a very specific topic to everyone. And a lot of people use it for that purpose. Another way we're seeing change in the L&D space is around the focus inside organizations. So we used to, and this still exists today, but it's certainly metamorphosized or morphed over the years, right? Learning and development, and especially instructional design, was really born out of a need to close learning gaps. If you knew that your sales team was not performing to the extent that they could, you would say, you're performing here. We want to see this performance out of you. Here's our gap. And we're going to design a really specific learning program to meet that very specific gap that we're seeing today, so that we can bring you from point A to point B in your performance. And that still exists today. And there's still room for that, certainly. There was also, learning and development was also born out of a need for compliance. And quite frankly, HR really came out of a need for compliance as well. And we're seeing, of course, shifts in that space as well. Compliance looking like all of our people need to have strong security measures, right, within their organizations. All of our people need to be trained on how to not harass people, right, harassment training, so on and so forth. And again, that's kind of like the sort of bare minimum that we're seeing today. Now we're seeing learning and development really shift into new realms and meet new needs within the organization. Things like, when people get promoted, what kind of training do they need in order to really be set up for success in their role, both in terms of, if they're managing people for the first time, that looks a lot different than being an individual contributor, and so on and so forth. And so organizations are spending a lot of time, money, and energy into really creating these pathways to success within the organization as they move throughout the organization. And then finally, this really points back to my earlier opening story of, I think more organizations are starting to tap into this idea of learning inspires, right? When we learn something new, it inspires something in us and usually creates a desire to change. And then that inspiration carries us throughout a change. And this, I think, has been born out of the past couple years of COVID, of discussions around just justice, of social movements that are going on, right? So on and so forth. More organizations are looking for ways to inspire their people to stay, inspire their people in their jobs, and really give people a purpose, and learning can fulfill that. So lots of impacts on L&D. Explain kind of the key themes of like how learning is changing over time and how it's really expanding. Being a learning and development leader right now, I know that, your job description has probably expanded in a hefty amount over the past couple of years. And there's a few reasons for that. And by a few, I mean kind of a lot, and you see them on this slide. So we know that over the past couple of years, majority of businesses had to make business practice adjustments as a result of COVID-19. We've done research on that. McKinsey's done research on that. Everyone has kind of honed in on this idea that business practice adjustments happened. And as a result, so did internal processes. HR, learning and development, and DEI programs in particular have seen massive growth over the past 2 years because of business practice adjustments. Another major influencing factor was skills shortages. And that, we all know that, for example, tech workers, high demand, right? There are not enough folks with technology skills to be able to really serve our market of open job opportunities right now. Interestingly, Amazon and Gallup teamed up, did a little bit of research on this, and I found this pretty interesting. They found that 48%, so almost half of American workers, would switch their jobs if offered skills training opportunities. I thought this was interesting for a variety of reasons. I won't go into them, but one of the reasons is, I'm sure many of you saw a couple years ago, Amazon made a pledge to invest $900 million into reskilling warehouse workers into technologists within Amazon. And so I think they were very curious to see if that was a replicable program that more organizations could do, and not just for technology, right? Whatever the organization needed, just so happens that Amazon really is a technology company, so they needed technologists. We're also seeing, obviously, the influence of the Great Resignation. I'm sure everyone is feeling that painfully so right now. Internally, we like to call this the Great Reflection, because ultimately the Great Resignation was born out of people having a moment with themselves, being presented with a moment in time that was forcing them to reflect and really ask themselves, what did they need and what did they want, and how could they work on becoming what they wanted to become? And we're starting to see that evolve right before our eyes right now. We're also seeing, as a result of the Great Reflection, the Great Resignation, employees are advocating for their needs. And when they're not getting their needs met, they're leaving organizations in order to find those needs elsewhere. Hence the conversation around hybrid work, remote work, workplace flexibility, so on and so forth. Another really interesting, I think, impact on L&D right now is the generations in the workforce. And we won't go too deep into here. I know there's a lot of feelings around this topic in general, but the facts are our largest generation by birth are the baby boomer generation. However, the largest living generation right now is the millennial generation, born largely by the baby boomer generation. We know that baby boomers are starting to leave the workforce. Saw a big jump in that leaving the workforce just last year in 2021. With that, they're leaving jobs open that need to get filled, right? And with the baby boomer generation being the largest generation, it's also leaving some generational gaps and potentially some knowledge transfer that is being left behind as a result of those kind of massive movement out of the workforce. Similarly, as a result of that, millennials are now assuming more management and leadership roles within organizations, which is having an impact on learning and development departments because they're really training their next generation of leaders for their organizations. And then we're also seeing a really interesting conversation about needs being met in the workplace. And a lot of that conversation is being generated out of the Gen Z perception of work. And I think fairly and rightfully so. It's a really interesting one to watch transform. Other impacts, of course, are therefore, we mentioned workplace flexibility and of course, technology. Technology is just making it easier for people to find learning across the board, whether that be TikTok or whether that be YouTube is being used for learning, right? Or that be more formal and traditional ways of learning. We're seeing an expansion in the way we seek and find learning opportunities. And I want to give some kudos to L&D right now. I loved finding this data. This was provided just a month or so ago, I believe, by LinkedIn, certainly in 2022. They did a whole report on how learning and development is really holding up a lot of organizations and changing the way we're doing work. And there's a lot of positivity coming out of this. So they found that 74% of people agree that L&D has become more cross-functional internally in the organization. They also found that there was a 94% increase in July through September in 2021 for jobs for L&D specialists. And we saw that on the SHRM side too, with the organizations that we work with. More and more organizations are investing time, money, resources, people into learning and development opportunities within their organizations for all of those reasons that I just mentioned, right? All of these shifts that are happening in the economy and in business, organizations realize that they're going to have to take more responsibility for upskilling and training their people now and into the future, and they're investing in those capabilities. 72% of the respondents agreed that L&D had become a more strategic function at their organization, which I love to see. Just being that I think we've all heard the kind of complaints over the years of HR and L&D being a cost center, but these organizations and more specifically business leaders are really starting to see the value, the strategic value of investing in these types of roles in their organizations in order to flourish as a business. And then finally, 87% of learning and development professionals had some to a great deal of involvement in helping their organization adapt to change. And I think this points back again to the first story that I shared, right? Learning and development at its core is about change. It's about inspiring change and supporting people with change, which we know is difficult, and supporting businesses with change. And I think that's another reason, of course, that we're seeing such investment in this space is organizations know that they have to change now, and they know they're going to have to keep changing in the future in order to remain competitive in the world that we live in today. So I think we'll continue to see really drastic increases in learning and development going into the future. So learning and development today, I want to transition where we are now, what the conversation is looking like, and what do people want? People want truly three core things. I mean, there's some other layers to it, but if you were to put all of the things that people want from their organizations into three buckets, this is usually what it comes down to. First one being purpose. Purpose had always been a part of the conversation for the past 5-6 years now, but it really got underlined and highlighted due to COVID. We've done research on this. McKinsey's done research on this. This was pretty interesting. McKinsey found that 2/3 of US-based employees said that COVID-19 caused them to reflect on their purpose in life. And as a part of that reflection, right, that great reflection I think many of us went through, it caused us to decide what that purpose is and find alignment between our purpose and the organization that we work for. And I think we'll continue to see that certainly be a trend into the future. The other piece is pay, compensation, right? This is a really interesting one to me because when you look at compensation changes over the past, quite frankly, since 2008, since our last recession, pay and compensation did not match inflation year over year. Compensation actually only just started to reach the levels it should have been a year before the pandemic hit, was just starting to reach that where it should have been. And then the pandemic, because of the 2008 recession, and then COVID-19 hit, and obviously that impacted compensation and pay more. And so when we talk about, people leaving for higher compensation in organizations, and this kind of a lot of organizations are restructuring comp and benefits plans as a result of this, you could argue it was the Great Reflection. You could also argue that the holistic look across society of compensation really didn't match up to the way inflation was going, as it should have matched up. And so people are, in part because of the Great Reflection, realizing that, and they want to see that corrected. And so this is showing up again and again as a major topic, or people and organizations are negotiating on. And our final P in this line of purpose, pay, and then finally people. People are looking for good places to work, and they're looking especially for good managers to work for. We did a bunch of research in 2018 and have subsequently done some add-on research since, finding that the majority of reasons people leave jobs is because of people managers. It's because of their people managers. And there's a whole host of sub reasons that fall under that, right? People managers not having good people management skills, people managers not respecting their employees, people managers not giving their employees a chance to show their skill sets, and therefore people feeling left like their skill sets are underutilized. Lots of reasons that feed into that, but ultimately one of the greatest predictors of whether or not someone's going to stay in an organization are people managers and the people that they work with. And this is interesting for us to know, right? So as learning and development professionals, we need to know where the problem points are so that we can design stronger, inspiring content and knowledge that is going to keep people there and keep people interested. So I want to take a quick look at the chat. If you would, do me a favor. Why do you think people are seeking learning opportunities? If you could just jot in a few notes. Why are people looking for learning opportunities, specifically within their organizations? What are they looking for? What is learning supposed to solve for? Amazing. Thank you to both Melissas. Career progression, growth, further their development, professional growth. Learning new things will keep engagement high, totally. To grow within the organization, absolutely. Move forward and value advancement. They want to see increase in salary as a result of their learning, totally. Purpose, career growth, awesome. Self-growth and advancement. So amazing. I love this focus on growth in a lot of ways. And y'all are spot on. So LinkedIn found that the top 3 reasons people seek learning opportunities are: 1, to stay up to date in their field. So our fields are always changing, right? New thing, especially if you're in learning and development in HR right now, it's like every day is new data and information that we have to involve in the workplace. So people are seeking learning to stay up to date. People are seeking learning to pursue their personal interests and their goals, right? Everyone has usually a set of goals and they're trying to find ways to make their goals a reality. Learning is a great way to do that. So I saw growth in the chat, a whole bunch, definitely points to that. And then to achieve career goals like being promoted or pursuing an internal opportunity. Absolutely. And that came up in the chat as well. So top 3 reasons that we're seeing, right? Another key theme in the learning and development space being talked about is around internal mobility and utilizing skill sets successfully. So, and this really points to engagement. So I saw somebody or several people in the chat put, utilizing learning as an engagement tool, and it's totally true. I love this stat by LinkedIn. Employees who don't feel like their skills are being put to good use are 10 times more likely to leave a job, which I think is really important as learning and development professionals to know, right? If people are feeling underutilized, that's a really strong indicator that they're going to leave and we'll have a retention challenge, right? So I think that's fascinating. The other piece is around internal mobility and retention. So companies that excel at internal mobility are able to retain employees for an average of 5.4 years, which is nearly twice as long as organizations who don't have internal mobility plans, right? And so what that looks like is really a partnership opportunity between whoever's in HR doing kind of workforce planning and whoever is focused on learning and development to say, we need to create pathways for people inside the organization, because when they get bored with their job or when they feel underutilized with their job, we need to keep them engaged. And that might mean moving them laterally inside the organization. That might mean moving them up inside the organization if they're a high performer and they're kind of slated for that, right? But the organization essentially taking on more responsibility to, in order to keep people engaged, create movement for them so that people are being presented with new opportunities and therefore much more likely, or in this case, twice as likely, they're likely to stay twice as long as other employees. Another really interesting facet of the L&D space today, and part of the conversation, is around skills. And all of us know that tech skills, that's an easy target. There are not enough people with the technology skills needed in order to be successful in order to fill the number of jobs available for technology roles today. There just aren't enough people for it. But one of the areas that we're talking, I think, a little bit less and a little bit more about is this conversation around soft skills and around self-management skills, which I find really interesting. The World Economic Forum, and they do phenomenal research on skills and what people are going to need in order to be successful now and into the future as it relates to skills. They put out some research, I believe it's twice a year, and they found in their research, and they look at the entire world of job opportunities, right? What people say that they need now, and use that information in order to predict what they're going to need in 5 years' time. And what we've been talking about in this space for the past couple of years is, as we move to make work more technologically supported, we're going to need people to have more core people, AKA soft skills, in order to be successful. And so they've predicted, as a result of this, essentially fourth industrial revolution, they've predicted that half of all employees are going to need reskilling by 2025, as our adoption of technology continues. And it's not just technology skills, right? It's as we lean on tech to do more things that can be automated, we are going to need to utilize more of the skills that make us human. Things like creativity, things like decision making, right? Things like problem solving. They said that critical thinking and problem skills remain the top two most in demand skills now, and are certainly going to become more so in the future. The other really interesting piece, I think, about the research that they've put out recently around skills is, because of COVID-19, they identified a needed bucket of skills that they had never identified before. And that needed bucket of skills they call self-management skills. And essentially, and it's probably no shocker that it was born out of COVID-19, because we needed these in COVID-19, but essentially self-management skills are when we're hit with a stressful environment, when we're hit with a change, when we're hit with, a jolt to the system, we need to have the ability to manage ourselves in those moments. And that looks like, how do we show resilience, right? How do we push forward when things get really tough and show grit? That looks like stress management. So when 500 things are flying around, how do we internally manage our stress so that we can keep going and exhibit that resilience? And then things like flexibility. When our business makes a business practice adjustment and acquires maybe another business or merges with another business, how do we essentially self-manage to create that flexibility in those different and varying scenarios, which are coming up, pretty consistently now. And I think we're going to, it's been predicted that we're going to continue to see changes occurring on a faster basis. Hopefully nothing like as big and as challenging as COVID-19 in a lot of ways, but organizations, I think globally, organizations got a shock to the system because of COVID-19 and are now preparing to be shocked consistently. And that's showing up in a lot of that's showing up in learning and development. It's showing up in workforce planning, how organizations decide whether or not they're going to add new employees to their team or have to retract or condense their teams, so on and so forth. And that general theme, though, of getting prepared for change is showing up across the enterprise globally. So all of this to say, lots of information, right? Lots of changes. I think there's a lot of interesting data here, but all of it kind of points to a picture of what L&D is going to look like in the future. There's this great graphic that I came across. Degreed posted it here just a couple months ago. Excuse me, just need a sip of water. And essentially they're looking at, this, what expectations of L&D we've had versus how that's changing into the future. And this should be a pretty solid summary of some of the things we've already touched on, right? Talked about how L&D was really focused on kind of hyper-focused on performance and closing performance gaps, hyper-focused on compliance, making sure that people are meeting the requirements, and then really focused on readiness, job readiness. Can they do the job successfully, and are we setting them up for success? Now we're really transitioning into adding in some of these other key pieces. So old expectations still exist, but L&D and the role of L&D has really expanded to include that which was old expectations to that which is new expectations and all that's in between. And again, we're seeing adaptability show up, which points directly to, what we talked about in the influence that COVID-19 has had. Innovation, resilience, again, I love this description, being able to absorb shocks, right? To the business, to the system, to our roles, to ourselves. Agility, being able to respond quickly, being able to protect ourselves in the process of change and shocks. There's, of course, this added layer, which I haven't even touched on completely, which is around our conversation in belonging and inclusion, which has erupted within organizations, right? This idea of how do we create a culture where everyone feels like they belong? And learning and development, I know, is playing really monumental roles now. I am sure they're going to continue to play really, really monumental roles into the future in how we create that belonging. And there's going to be, I think, a really interesting intersection between belonging and people managers and the role that L&D provides to people managers to be able to create spaces of belonging on their own individual teams. And then, of course, ultimately, we're going to see, essentially learning and development really play a strong role in engagement and retention. So I think when we look at models for learning and development, some key themes are showing up, some key components that organizations are utilizing to create a really holistic and individualized learning and development strategy. Organizations are, of course, incorporating on-the-job training. That's been the case in the past. It'll continue to be the case. A lot of people need to learn by doing to some extent, but that's going to be one of kind of 6 main components of a person's learning journey. Secondly is going to be learning from others. And we could really loop in what that looks like from a peer-to-peer standpoint here, being able to leverage peers' individual talents and skills in order to coach peer-to-peer and help peer-to-peer in a learning kind of sense. Learning via instruction is going to continue to be a theme, has been in the past, right? Where you have to set up a 1-hour webinar or a 1-hour session on a particular focus in order to dive into a particular topic. We're also, of course, I think, going to see these individual learning pathways in order to upskill. And this is looking like a variety of things. On the smaller business side, technology is playing a huge role here with these individual learning plans, right? It looks like something as simple as really like a marketplace of learning for an organization where each individual employee goes in and says, I want to work on X, Y, and Z. And that marketplace says, since you want to work on that, here's some options for you to consider adding to your individualized learning plan. It also looks like things like apps, Things like kind of riffing off of the idea of TikTok, where if you have 5 minutes between meetings and you're waiting, why don't you pull out your phone and learn something new? And that could be useful to you in your job. And that could be, things like gamified learning plans that you engage with. It could be a variety of things, really. And there's a lot of technologies that are helping to support that. Individualized learning could also look like more sophisticated technologies. I've come across one which is pretty powerful. They do massive upskilling efforts across entire states, and think like our biggest states or entire countries. And essentially what they do is analyze what a person's skill set is and utilize 4 different points to identify that skill set, and then identify the proficiency of that skill set, and then match that person very uniquely to a variety of learning options that they can choose from in order to get them from where they are to where they want to be. We're also seeing this emergence, I would say, of team building and experience-based learning. To some extent, this has been around, right? Things like conferences are experience-based learning. Certainly, you're immersed in it, right? But I think there's new ways that we're also seeing this show up. Things like technologies or kind of learning experiences that can be done virtually in order to foster team psychological safety, and therefore team bonding, and therefore greater trust, and therefore greater engagement, right? We're seeing this kind of emergence and focus on psychological safety in particular. And there's some really interesting ways in order for team leads, right, people managers, to be able to foster that better on their teams. And this is a great way that learning and development can support, is they can provide these sorts of recommendations to teams that might be struggling, or people managers that might be struggling, or new people managers, right? Be able to give them these tools so that they can start their teams off in a really engaging, really trusting, really psychologically safe kind of space, so that that allows for greater innovation and engagement on the team. And then finally, there's certainly this emphasis and this focus on mentorship and coaching. And I love the evolution of this that's happening. Is we're moving less from a space of this one-dimensional, like you give me something and I learn, and much more this two-dimensional, hey, we can both teach each other on something, and we can both grow as a result. Both giving, both getting in return. And I think more organizations are starting to adopt that type of mindset. I'm keeping an eye on time. I promise I'm wrapping up here. So future-proofing your organization. I think there's a few tips here, just to recap, that I think all, learning and development professionals, if they're not working on now, it's probably going to be incorporated into the future. The first one is learning and development professionals need to prioritize their own learning. This space is changing day by day. New investments are getting put into this space every day. Venture capital investments are starting to really see value in investing in this space, because larger, all businesses are really putting investment, time, and money into it. And so in order for learning and development professionals to do this well now into the future, they do need to prioritize their own learning. LinkedIn found that it's not posted here on this slide, but they actually found that majority of learning and development professionals, because they've been putting out fires for the past 2 years, have not been prioritizing their own learning. And that really comes at a disservice to them, right? To not be able to pull in the latest and greatest knowledge that exists out there, that's coming up every single day into their organization. So one of the major takeaways is learning and development professionals. I know it's easy to want to give and give and give, make sure to receive back too, because that's going to make you stronger in the end. And there are a couple areas where learning and development professionals have self-identified as areas that they want to improve on. Things like data analysis, which are really becoming crucial in this space. We didn't really even touch on that, but being able to track metrics of success, right? And then feed those back to business leaders so that learning and development professionals can make a case for needing certain things, but also in that making a case, they end up getting more resources, right? So if we're tracking that kind of information and the success of our efforts, we'll be able to see stronger investment in the organization as a result. Secondly is, and I realize this is a tough dance to play, but essentially learning and development professionals really do need an inroad into the business decisions that are being made into the future. And the reason why is it comes back to that workforce planning conversation, right? If you know, for example, that today you are a transportation company and tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but in 5 years, you want to become a tech-based transportation company. That means between now and 5 years, you need to build the infrastructure for technology to be a part of it, right? Which means you need the staff to be a part of building that infrastructure, which means that the staff need to be trained to build that infrastructure. And so when you kind of backwards plan from there, you realize that you only have really a couple of years to plan for that type of like massive workforce transformation. And so I think more and more organizations are doing this, but essentially partnering with business leaders to decide what that future vision of business looks like, and then matching up a workforce plan that's going to help them get there, and then layering on top of that the learning and development needs they're going to have in order to get there. And you could argue that Amazon did exactly that, right? They said $900 million. We know we're going to need X amount of technologists and we don't have them, and we can't source them because they don't exist today. So we're going to put into motion, I think it was a 4 to 5 year learning plan to get them where they needed to go. I know that was a massive example, but I think that there's a lesson there, right, of planning into the future. Scalable learning strategies based on how individuals want to grow. Obviously, this is a conversation between people managers and individual contributors, and how they can make alignment between where people want to grow and what opportunities they have in the organization, whether it be on their team or somewhere else. And then being able to set in individual learning journeys in order to get there. And again, I think technology can play a really strong role in that piece in particular. There are small business solutions that are coming out of this space, as well as really large and holistic versions as well. And then finally, kind of coming off of my last point of leveraging technology, there are lots of really interesting ways that technology can be utilized in order to further learning goals within the organization. We've seen things like text message learning, which has been adopted by companies that have, let's say, manufacturing plants. So organizations who make automobiles, the people who make those automobiles don't really get to sit at a desk, but they can get learning come into their cell phone, and be able to leverage that in order to learn. So really it's about making learning much more accessible to all levels within an organization. And technology is able to help people to get there. And there's a lot of opportunity coming out of the learning and tech space. And with that, lucky, we got 11 minutes left, and I would love to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Erica. This was great. I can help monitor the Q&A box. For all those attending, you can use the Q&A box or the chat to ask questions.
Sorry, I ended kind of abruptly. I probably should have walked to that ending, but I was trying to get to that time mark. I was really committed to it.
Nothing's coming in right now. You must have just covered it all.
It's a lot of content, I recognize. Thank you, Sandy. Appreciate the note. And also Nancy, appreciate the note. Mhm.
I'm getting lots of nice feedback, and I have to agree, Erica. I feel like as someone who tries to attend as many HR relevant webinars that I can, this is a topic that I don't see covered as much. So I really appreciated some of the insights from today.
Good.
Well, I think we're all set. I think we will sign off. Thank you to everyone for attending. Erica, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Yeah.
Again, as Nick said, the webinar has been recorded. It will be emailed out after the fact, but thanks everyone for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day.